Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our. How are y'all today? Y'all good? Well, it's good to see you. Glad you're here. Those of you that are joining us online, we want to welcome you also to our Bible study today. And today we're going to take a turn today in the story. Very familiar story to y'all. And we're going to begin the story of Joseph. So Genesis 37 is where we'll begin if you have your Old Testament with you. And it's interesting how Moses, presumably, begins this section. He ends the last page with, this is the family line of Esau. And then it's almost like he is giving you a summary of the end of Jacob's life. It's almost like here's now Jacob in retirement. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, in the land of Canaan. And it sounds very calm and docile. And what's about to unfold, though, is anything but that. This amazing story is about to take place. So as I put on your outline, the story of Joseph begins here in Genesis 37, and it will now dominate the rest of this book. The story of Joseph will have one little kind of interlude that will happen next week, and that's the story of Judah. But for the most part, the rest of Genesis is about Joseph. So think about that. We've had 36 pages, if you will, dedicated to the creation of everything that is, an understanding of the table of nations, the calling of Abraham, the great patriarch and the father of the people of God. And then you've had a good bit of material given to Jacob. But now, starting here and all the way to chapter 50, we're pretty much going to talk about Joseph. So obviously, this is an important character. And when you study rabbinical literature, the Jewish interpretations of Joseph, that'll make sense to you because he becomes one of the most revered and loved characters in the patriarchal narrative. And then you'll have some references to Joseph in the New Testament. Stephen refers to him in his sermon. The writer of Hebrews mentions Joseph in Hebrews 11. And then y'all do remember the name of Jesus' earthly father. And you remember how God spoke to him in Matthew 1 and 2. Remember how God spoke to Joseph in a dream. So many folks have connected that Joseph, at least in a sense of a type, if you will, to this Joseph. It's kind of fascinating when you look at the history of Christian interpretation of Joseph. In the Jewish mind, he's somewhat of an idealized figure, which he's presented that way often in their literature. But when you come to the New Testament era, Joseph is mentioned specifically a couple of times, maybe alluded to in the story of Joseph and Mary. We're not sure about that, but that's what some think. You even have some who think that Jesus borrows a phrase from this story when he tells the story about the man who owned the land, and he sent his servants, to check on what was happening. Finally, he sent his son. Remember, they took his son and they killed him. It's a similar phrase, if you were to read that and translate that into Hebrew, that you'll find in this story about Joseph. So even that story is somewhat connected to him. But what's fascinating is when you make your way into the first couple hundred years of Christian history, around AD 200 to 300, you have pastors and theologians who are beginning to grapple with all of these stories, and they're preaching and teaching them to the churches. And you have two huge schools of biblical interpretation in the early history of Christianity. You have the Antiochene school. Those were the folks who were primarily schooled in the city of Antioch, and they were heavily influenced by the history of the church at Antioch. And there were a whole group of pastors and theologians who were trained there and had a certain perspective on their understanding of the Old Testament. Then in Egypt, in Alexandria, you got a whole nother school that was established of a group of Christian scholars and pastors and teachers who went to that school, and they had a very different understanding of the Old Testament. So it's quite fascinating because the Antiochian school was very practical and very literal in their understanding of the Scripture. And they focused primarily on the earthly ministry of Jesus and the humanity of Jesus, which is not that surprising because Antioch in Syria is not that far actually from Jerusalem, and they had a strong tie to the church at Jerusalem, and so they tended to be more literal in their interpretation of the Scripture. Alexandria had been established as a Greek citadel, and so after Alexander the Great took over the world, and so Alexandria had been heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, Plato in particular, so they tended to take a little more of an allegorical approach to interpreting the Old Testament. So it's kind of fascinating when you read sermons from the 200s, 300s, early 400s from those two different schools of preachers. So the Alexandrian preachers, when they taught on Joseph, they saw him as a pre-Christ figure. And they drew on things like how he was betrayed by his brothers, how he had the blood of this animal, his clothes were dipped in the blood of this animal. Then in a sense, he kind of died when he was thrown into the pit. But ultimately, he's going to be resurrected. He's going to forgive his brothers in this great act of grace. And so they tended to draw upon the facets of Joseph's life that reminded them of Jesus. The Antiochian preachers just preached on the earthly story of Joseph and saw him as a noble character, but not necessarily prefiguring Christ. I say all that just to say that this man has just captured the imagination of theologians, Jewish and Christian, pretty much ever since this story has been written. So it'd be hard to exaggerate the influence of Joseph in the theological development of Judaism or the church. So we will approach Joseph that way, knowing that he's not Abraham, for sure, and yet at the same time, he's somewhat unrivaled, though, during the time that he dominates the story in the book of Genesis. Does that make sense? He is a huge character in the life of Israel. Now, with that said, before we get to Joseph, we've got to go back, though, to Genesis 15, because there's an experience that Abraham had many years prior to this, where Abraham is in this dialogue with God, and God is about to initiate this covenantal relationship with Abraham and promise him all of this land that would become known as the Promised Land. But he has this interesting encounter with God in Genesis 15, verse 12, where the text says, as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I'll punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So God gives this prophetic pronouncement to Abraham, many, many years earlier, that a lot is going to unfold in the life of his descendants. And one of the things that's going to happen is they're going to spend somewhere around 400 years or so in captivity. And then eventually, once the sins of all of the ites, Amorites are singled out here, but all the ites in Canaan come to bear, it's going to be time to judge them. And Israel is going to come through, and they're going to be the vehicle through which God's going to use to judge all of these folks in Canaan, and the land is going to be delivered over to Abraham's descendants. Now, it's interesting when you read that story, you have to wonder, did Abraham pass that story on to his children and his grandchildren? So is this a story, a prophecy that Isaac and Jacob would have known about? In other words, did they anticipate that there was some kind of sojourn in the future for them as descendants of Abraham? Well, we don't really know, but we do know that God did say it to Abraham, and we're going to watch it, the beginnings of it, take place, kind of the genesis of it all, if I can say that word, in this story that we're going to look at today. So with all that said, let's look at Genesis 37. Now, remember we've talked about these toledots. That's the Hebrew word for this is the account of, or these are the generations of. You have numerous ones of those in the book of Genesis. In fact, some scholars divide Genesis according to those. So we have another one of those here, verse 2. This is the account, the toledot, if you will, the story of Jacob's family line. And then he gives us just this introduction to Joseph. Joseph, a young man of 17, says, was tending the flocks with his brothers. Interesting phrase in Hebrew. A little bit difficult to put into English because you could actually translate this was tending his brothers. Now that would be a fascinating twist on the interpretation, wouldn't it? Because it's the word for shepherding. But you can't actually translate it that way. Most translators don't. But there's some who say that that's really what's happening here. So that would be quite fascinating that the youngest brother, Benjamin's too young to be out in the field. Okay, so Joseph is the younger brother now of the rest of his siblings, besides Benjamin. And so he's tending the flocks with his brothers. And it's interesting that the writer tells us these particularly were the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. So if you look back in chapter 35, verse 25 and 26, you'll discover that's Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Now the inference is, just the way that it's written, evidently they were all out there, but in particular these were. So and it kind of lets you know that there's tension in this family. They're not all known just as brothers. They're actually known by who their mother is. And in this story so far, you have four options. You've got Leah and her maidservant, and you've got Rachel and her maidservant. And so there seems to be even division within this family based on who your mama was. Now, Jacob's all of their dad, obviously, but there's a little bit of underlying tension, evidently. And then you have this kind of fascinating thing about Joseph. And again, it refers to those women as Jacob's wives. But then it says this, and he brought their father a bad report about them. And there you have it. What does that mean? Does that mean that he had Joseph there to spy on them, just to tell him what's going on with his brothers, what kind of job they were doing, what kind of shepherds they were? Well, we'll see about that. But then notice the comment in verse 3. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Don't you love how real the Bible is? Just go ahead and tell us like it is. This is the favored son, okay? And he says because he'd been born to him in his old age, obviously we all know he's also Rachel's son. So he made an ornate robe for him. A little bit hard to translate into English. We usually have known it as a coat of many colors. That comes from the King James Version translation of this. The King James Version translation comes from the Septuagint translation of this, the Greek translation of this Hebrew text. And there's the implication of it being a multicolored type of royal robe, if you will. And verse 4, when his brothers saw that their fathers loved him more than any of them, they blessed Joseph and were so proud to be his brother, right? So it says they hated him and they couldn't speak a kind word to him. So Joseph is introduced as the favored son. Now once again, it kind of fits into this overall narrative. Abraham has Ishmael first, remember? But he's not the favored son. He's not the son of promise. Then he has Isaac. Then Isaac has Esau and Jacob, right? But Esau is not the favored son. Even though he's the older son, he's not the son that's to be chosen. And now Jacob has these children, and Reuben is the oldest son. But Reuben is not going to be the favored son. And remember, Reuben has actually usurped his father's authority by this time in the story. He's kind of stepped into a role that would have been his had he waited. for his father to die, but he chose not to do that for whatever reason. So Reuben's already been ruled out. And Joseph is not necessarily going to be the son of promise to steward the promise. That's going to come through Judah, which is quite fascinating. But Joseph is unquestionably introduced as the favored son, even though he's not the older son. And it seems as if, from the very beginning, Joseph is chosen for a certain destiny. And I would tell y'all there's a mix of the sovereignty of God in all of this that's obviously very challenging for us to try to comprehend. But the giftedness of Joseph and his unique abilities are going to be on display pretty soon in this story. So he is introduced as the favored boy in the family, okay? And again, and what I would say in Joseph's defense, he had nothing to do with that. You know? There doesn't seem to be a request here from Joseph that his dad give him the coat of many colors. So you can argue there's a little bit of innocence in Joseph so far, okay? Now that argument gets a little dicey with this next section, okay? Because he is actually the dreamer. Look at verse 5. So Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. Again, I love the honesty of the text. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. I can't imagine why his brothers would have a hard time with this story. It's a great dream. Some dreams you should just keep to yourself. Don't y'all think? You can just have them and understand them. But Joseph just couldn't help himself. And so he lets them know that this is what he saw. So, verse 8, his brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream. And he obviously has learned his lesson by now. He just tells it to his brothers. He said, hey, I had another dream. Dreams appear in couplets in Joseph's story. It's going to happen later when he gets to Egypt. They're going to be the two dreams that Pharaoh has. He says, he had another dream, and he said, the sun and the moon and 11 stars are bowing down to me. So the implication is the entire family, in other words, is one day going to be beholden to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him. And he said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? So publicly, Jacob rebukes Joseph. But let's remember, Jacob's also a dreamer, right? And so notice what it says in verse 11. His brothers were jealous of him, but his father privately kept this matter in mind. In other words, his daddy knows when a dream comes from God. He had one, remember, at Bethel. And so I think Jacob is realizing that this boy Joseph is even more gifted and has a brighter future than he's ever even imagined for him. And so he's going to hold on to this. Now, the imagery of the entire family bowing before Joseph obviously is one that is going to come to fruition before this thing is done. So now you get to verse 12, and his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. Remember, we've been to Shechem before. We've had incidents there we've already read about. And for some reason, Israel says to Joseph, you know, your brothers are grazing their flocks near Shechem. I'm going to send you to them. And he says, very well, he replies, and he says, go and see if all's well with your brothers, with the flocks, and bring word back to me. And he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. So, these boys are already in a tense relationship. And it's not helped by not the dreams that Joseph had, but the fact that Joseph told them about the dreams that he had. That's where this thing is getting much more challenging and difficult. So there's tension building in this story. Underneath all of this, there's already tension simply because of how, to me, the writer shares some of the details. Like I said, he refers to the boys by who their mother was. It seems to imply there's already divisions in the ranks, and now it's only going to be made worse because of how they view Joseph. So here's the plot. There's this desire when these brothers see him. Now, it's not going to be hard for them to tell when he's coming because he has this very interesting coat that evidently he wears everywhere. So, and again, I don't necessarily blame Joseph for that, but his brothers certainly did. So when you get to verse 18, it says, when they saw him in the distance before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Now that definitely shows you how tense these relationships are and just how deep-seated the hurt is in this family. And then verse 19, now remember, Joseph's a long way from his daddy. Okay, so he's not under the protection of Jacob. And so the sons say, here comes the dreamer. They said, come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him, and then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Okay? So Reuben, who's already in trouble, right? His dad is already mad at him. He's already violated his dad. He's already tried to usurp his dad's authority. And he is the older brother, so he knows he's going to be held responsible for what happens to Joseph, and he knows good and well Joseph's the favorite son. So Reuben, probably self-serving, to be honest, but be that as it may, he tries to rescue Joseph, and he says, let's don't take his life. Let's don't shed any blood. Let's throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness. Don't lay a hand on him. And basically, he's just trying to intervene and see if they'll calm down in their anger. And for some reason, Reuben leaves, and in his mind, he'll come back and get Joseph out of this empty well or empty cistern, if you will, and take him home. So notice verse 23. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of the robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, and there was no water in it, and they sat down and ate. What a fascinating family dynamic. First they're going to kill him. Then they decide, no, they'll just take his coat off of him, throw him into a cistern that he can't get out of his own. And then one of them says, I'm hungry. Yeah, me too. And so they sit down and eat. Again, there's just a lot of tension here in this family and in this story. Now, what we're going to learn later is, when you get to this, as this story unfolds, this wasn't as smooth as it sounds, because they're going to recall all of this. So when you get to Genesis 42, once, as my mama used to say, the chickens came home to roost. Y'all know what I mean by that, right? Once all of a sudden they get into a very different scenario with Joseph, you get to chapter 42, and they said to one another, we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we wouldn't listen. So we don't hear that in Genesis 37, but we get it later in Genesis 42. Joseph begged them not to do this. So he's begging for his life, and the brothers remember, and we didn't listen to him. Okay, so this thing is not as smooth as it seems to be represented here. This was a fight. I don't think Joseph casually just fell over into the cistern. Okay, they had a fight on their hands, and it must have taken several of them, and they finally get him in there. So now they're sitting there eating, contemplating what they're going to do. Reuben is not with them, okay? So, verse 25, they sat down to eat their meal. They looked up and they see a caravan of all people. Ishmaelites. These sons of Isaac have a son of Isaac in a cistern and a group of Ishmaelites. Actually, what we're going to discover is within that group is a caravan of Midianites. So this is all one big happy family. Midian is Abraham's son through Keturah. You remember that? After Sarah died, he has another wife, Keturah, and he has a son named Midian. And the Midianites are going to live in the northern part of Canaan. He had an older son named Ishmael, and Ishmael's family is going to live in the northern part of Canaan. And by the time you get through part of the Old Testament, you get to the book of Judges, and you can no longer tell the difference between the Ishmaelites and the Midianites. In Judges 8, they're referred to as the same people. Most people think the Ishmaelite references to a general category of people, and the Midianites is more their ethnicity. But the point is, these are all cousins. These are all descendants of Abraham. The Ishmaelites, the Midianites, and the descendants of Isaac. So here they all together in one happy kind of relationship. And so these guys decide, when they see these Ishmaelites, look at verse 26. Judah says, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Now, let's give Judah credit here. and hope there's some nobility in this. That Judah is at least saying, I don't think I can kill my brother. Okay? I mean, when push comes to shove, they've calmed down a little bit. They've eaten, and they're kind of thinking through their actions. But then, in not much of a noble act, he says, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay hands on him. After all, he is our brother. He's our own flesh and blood. So are the Ishmaelites. So are the Midianites. Y'all are all Abraham's kids, okay? So the Midianite merchants came by, and his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, which was kind of the standard price for a young slave in those days. So Reuben comes back, verse 29, and Joseph's not there. He tears his clothes. Reuben now knows he's in trouble. I don't know that he's necessarily worried about where Joseph is per se. He's worried about facing Jacob. Okay? So he says, what am I going to do now? Verse 31, so the plot thickens because they've sold Joseph into slavery, and eventually y'all know that those merchants, when they get to Egypt, they're going to sell him to a prominent Egyptian named Potiphar. So Joseph will now be in slavery, and these boys have got to decide what's the story. Okay? Not the first group of brothers to concoct a story to their daddy, right? I mean, it's not like this is new. But this one's going to be a hard one. So, verse 31, they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in blood, and took the ornate robe back to their father. And I love how they put it. We're not really sure what happened, but we found this. It's kind of the way they tell the story. So what's Jacob supposed to infer? Only thing he knew to infer. So he says, this is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. So this is the big lie now. Now, how long are they going to have to hold on to this lie? From now on. It's going to follow them all the way to Egypt. It's going to follow them even after Jacob dies. They're going to have to continue this lie. And so it's going to be woven into the fabric of this family. So, all of Jacob's sons and daughters came to comfort him, verse 34, and he said, I will continue to mourn until I die. And so his father wept. And then the note about Joseph being sold into slavery. So the big lie is going to follow them the rest of their lives. When Jacob dies, those boys are going to come together and tell another lie. They're going to say, hey, I meant to tell you before Daddy died, he told us to tell you to be nice to us. Okay, so these boys are good at this, okay? But it creates a certain fracture in this family that was already there. Now it's exacerbated by their brokenness. So for the next 22 years, Jacob is going to live with his grief. And in his mind, his son, his favorite son, the son, if you think about it, the only time he was able to celebrate a birth with Rachel was when Joseph was born. Because when Benjamin was born, remember, Rachel died in childbirth. So there was no celebration, really, for Jacob in the birth of Benjamin. The only celebration happened with Joseph. So this is the only boy he celebrated with the woman that he really loved. And now, as far as he knows, he's dead. And he's going to live with that for 22 years before the truth is going to come out. So it's a fascinating story. So I would say this, 2 or 3 things about this text. The first one is, there's a divine promise given to Abraham. He is going to bless him, and through him he's going to bless all the families of the world. And that's being lived out in the lives of real people in real time. God could have done this any way he wanted to do it. He could have brought about the redemption of humanity in any way he saw fit. He chose to answer the sinfulness of man by making a powerful redemptive promise to Abraham that would ultimately be fulfilled in Jesus. But that promise has to be shepherded from Abraham to Jesus. It's got to be lived out through the lives of these people. And that's what these folks are doing right in front of us. And it's meeting obstacle after obstacle, right? I mean, you look, if you didn't know the whole story, if we were watching this for the very first time, we would all be wondering, so what's going to happen now? I mean, Reuben has violated his dad. Joseph, who seems to kind of be the guy, is now a slave in Egypt. I mean, what's going to happen to these people? And there's brokenness in the family. They're separated from each other. Now they're carrying a big lie with each other. So there's all this intrigue and tension that's just built into this narrative that makes it such a powerful, riveting story, and it's happening in real lives. The second thing I'd say is that God's provision and God's sovereignty then and now are on display even in the face of human decisions and frailty. This whole thing that we know as life and the universe and creation is all of God's idea. And if we think that God has taken his hands off of it, you would be incredibly mistaken. Somehow God has chosen to allow his sovereignty to be on display and his provision for his promises to be in force and in effect, even though he also is able to accomplish that when he allows the hands of human beings to be a part of the whole journey. So it's a fascinating tension that's found throughout the Scripture, where God has given human beings opportunities to choose and make decisions that will have real impact, but at the same time, he is shepherding something that's important to him. And that's what's happening right here. God's sovereignty is on display. He's not going to allow these obstacles to destroy the line of the promise. But at the same time, that promise is going to be influenced by the hands of these shepherds, these human beings. Well, think about it, y'all. We're in 2023, and here's what I would tell you. The sovereignty of God is still on display, even in the face of our decisions and our frailty. The promise of God that was given to Abraham, that is through him, all the families of the world will be blessed, is still in effect. That promise now is in our hands. We're the ones who are shepherding it. We're the ones who are stewarding the promise of God. We're the ones that are invested from a human perspective in the great plan of redemption. It's God's plan, and it's going to somehow be fulfilled according to his time and his will, but you and I have the chance to shape it. It's a fascinating thing that the Lord has created. And then, if you to study the Jewish theology, the grandest story in all of the history of Israel is the Exodus. Their theology, their understanding of God, their identity as people is rooted in the story of the Exodus. And so this story that we're beginning today is going to set the stage for that grandest story. This is the explanation of how these people are going to get to Egypt in the first place, to set the stage for the Exodus. And it's a remarkable, incredible story. And so I love the story of Joseph. He's one of my all-time favorite characters in the Bible. And I'm looking forward to watching him grow and mature, because that's exactly what's going to happen to Joseph. Right now, he's a little brash. Okay? He's a favorite son. He's a little bit entitled. But he's just gotten his comeuppance. Right? His brothers have basically communicated to him what they really think about him. So you wonder, as this story starts to unfold, just give yourself time to think about it all. What did this do to Joseph internally when he gets to Egypt? How is all of this going to affect him? Because he's going to be a long way from home, and he has no idea the story that's been told to his dad. He has no clue what's happening to his family, and he's going to have to craft a completely new identity in a foreign place that was totally unimpressed with Jewish shepherds. It's not like he's arriving as somebody. He's arriving as a slave, and he's got to completely reinvent himself. And that's part of this fascinating journey to me, that Joseph is going to accomplish something incredible. Obviously, the hand of God is on him, but the promise eventually is going to be singularly in his hands before this is over with. And so it's quite a story in our Bibles, that this grand story of redemption is now reduced down to this one boy who right now is a slave in Egypt. Okay? All right, I'm going to stop right there. So thank you for joining us online, and we'll see you next week. Okay?